The silver serving spoon trembled in Ruth Caldwell's weathered hand as Master Jeremiah's voice rose above the November wind that rattled the dining room windows. "Dear Heavenly Father, we gather today to give thanks for your abundant blessings." His words floated across the mahogany table where flickering candlelight cast dancing shadows on fine china and crystal goblets filled with imported wine. Behind him, Ruth stood motionless in her crisp white apron, her dark eyes fixed not on the roasted turkey she'd spent 3 days preparing, but on the thin rope of kitchen twine wrapped around her wrist like a prayer bracelet. In 60 seconds, Jeremiah Whitmore would discover that some prayers receive very different answers than expected. This is the story of how one woman's carefully planned Thanksgiving feast became her master's final meal, and why the most dangerous enemy is always the one who knows exactly how you like your gravy seasoned. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn of 1847 had painted the Shenandoah Valley in shades of amber and crimson, transforming the rolling hills of Riverside County into a tapestry that spoke of God's artistry and nature's generosity. The James River wound through the landscape like a silver ribbon, carrying the dreams and commerce of Virginia's plantation society toward distant markets where tobacco leaves would be transformed into gold that built mansions and bought human souls. Along the river banks, morning mist rose from waters that reflected not just the changing leaves, but the unchanging cruelty of a system that measured human worth in dollars and calculated suffering as the cost of doing business. Whitmore Hall stood like a monument to this prosperity, its red brick facade and white columns reaching toward heaven while its foundations rested firmly on the labor of people who would never taste the freedom that November air seemed to promise. The Georgian mansion commanded a view of 2,800 acres where tobacco plants had been harvested weeks earlier, their leaves now hanging in curing barns that dotted the property like wooden cathedrals dedicated to the worship of profit. Smoke from the barns mixed with wood fires from the slave quarters, creating a haze that softened the harsh edges of reality and made the plantation appear almost pastoral to visitors who chose not to look too closely at who tended the fires. The main house itself reflected the architectural ambitions of Virginia's planter class, with rooms designed for entertaining that proclaimed the owner's refinement and social position. Crystal chandeliers imported from England cast rainbow light across mahogany furniture polished to mirror brightness by hands that would never own anything more valuable than the clothes on their backs. Persian carpets muffled the footsteps of family members who moved through spaces where every decorative element had been carefully chosen to demonstrate wealth, taste, and the kind of cultural sophistication that supposedly justified their dominion over lesser beings. Ruth Caldwell had been part of this carefully orchestrated display of prosperity for 8 years, ever since Jeremiah Whitmore purchased her at an estate sale in North Carolina following her previous master's death from consumption. The transaction had been conducted with the same attention to detail that Jeremiah applied to buying livestock, with Ruth required to demonstrate her cooking skills by preparing a sample meal while potential buyers evaluated her teeth, examined her hands for signs of disease, and discussed her reproductive potential as casually as they might assess a broodmare's bloodlines. The winning bid of $900 reflected not just her culinary expertise, but also her age and apparent health, qualities that promised years of profitable service to whoever possessed the foresight to invest in such valuable human property. What none of the buyers that day could have perceived was the depth of loss that Ruth carried within her chest like a physical weight that made breathing difficult and sleep impossible. Her previous master's financial troubles had forced the sale of what he euphemistically called his surplus labor, a business decision that tore apart families with the same casual efficiency used to separate livestock. Ruth's children, James and Mary, had been sold to different plantations on the same day their mother was purchased by Jeremiah, the 3 of them scattered across North Carolina and Virginia like seeds thrown to inhospitable ground where they would be expected to take root and flourish despite being severed from everything that had nourished their growth. James had been 14 then, old enough to work in the fields but young enough to still reach for his mother's hand when thunderstorms frightened him during the night. Mary, only 12, had possessed a laugh that could transform even the dreariest day into something bearable, a sound that Ruth had not heard replicated in all the years since their separation. The last image Ruth retained of her children was their faces pressed against the slats of different wagons, their eyes wide with confusion and terror as they disappeared down separate roads that led to futures their mother could not imagine or influence. That moment had crystallized into something harder than diamond and infinitely more dangerous than anything Jeremiah Whitmore's money could purchase. The kitchen house at Whitmore Hall had become Ruth's domain, a separate building connected to the main house by a covered walkway that allowed her to transport meals without exposing the dining room to cooking smells or the sight of food preparation. The kitchen itself was a masterpiece of efficiency, with a massive brick fireplace capable of roasting entire deer, copper pots that gleamed like mirrors and shelves lined with spices imported from corners of the world that Ruth would never see. Here she had spent thousands of hours transforming raw ingredients into the elaborate meals that maintained the Whitmore family's reputation for hospitality and refinement, her skilled hands creating dishes that graced tables where the conversation often centered on the market value of people who looked exactly like herself. Adjacent to the kitchen lay Ruth's herb garden, a carefully tended plot where she grew the culinary plants that elevated her cooking above the ordinary fare served at less sophisticated plantations. Sage and thyme flourished beside rosemary and mint, while more exotic specimens occupied protected corners where they could benefit from the kitchen's warmth during cold snaps. To casual observers, the garden represented nothing more than a cook's natural interest in fresh seasonings, but Ruth had spent years studying the properties of every plant she cultivated, learning which leaves could soothe troubled stomachs and which roots could cause them. Knowledge was the only form of power available to someone in her position, and she had accumulated it with the same methodical patience that she applied to perfecting her recipes. The Whitmore family had established patterns of behavior that Ruth observed with the clinical attention of a naturalist studying dangerous predators. Jeremiah ruled the household with the casual tyranny that came naturally to men who had never questioned their right to make decisions about other people's lives, his moods shifting between paternalistic condescension and explosive anger depending on tobacco prices, weather conditions, and the quantity of bourbon he consumed each evening in his library. His wife Constance focused her energies on maintaining the social connections that sustained their position within Virginia's planter aristocracy, organizing dinner parties and charitable events that demonstrated the family's refinement while reinforcing the networks of mutual support that protected their shared interests. Their eldest child Benjamin had recently turned 16 and was being groomed to inherit both the plantation and the attitudes that made its operation possible. He had begun accompanying his father to slave auctions and business meetings, learning to evaluate human beings with the same detached expertise that his grandfather had applied to horseflesh. The boy showed natural aptitude for the family business, asking intelligent questions about crop rotation and labor management while displaying the kind of casual cruelty that suggested he would someday surpass his father's achievements in both prosperity and inhumanity. 14-year-old Hannah possessed her mother's social ambitions and had recently become engaged to the eldest son of a neighboring planter, a match that would consolidate land holdings while strengthening the political alliances that protected the plantation system from outside interference. Young Samuel at 11 remained somewhat innocent of the full implications of his privileged position, but Ruth had watched enough plantation children to recognize the signs of developing callousness that would eventually transform him into another version of his father and brother. He still occasionally treated Ruth with something approaching genuine affection, seeking comfort when nightmares troubled his sleep or when his father's discipline seemed too harsh. But these moments of vulnerability were becoming less frequent as Samuel learned that such displays of weakness were incompatible with his destiny as a master of other human beings. The approaching Thanksgiving celebration of 1847 represented an opportunity that Ruth had been planning for months, ever since she had learned that Jeremiah intended to invite 3 neighboring families to join the Whitmores for what he described as a traditional feast of gratitude and fellowship. The guest list would include Colonel Henry Ashford and his wife Elizabeth, whose plantation specialized in breeding slaves for sale to expanding territories in the West. Judge William Morrison would attend with his wife.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Catherine, bringing the legal expertise that helped draft contracts ensuring that human chattel remained profitable property rather than people with rights or futures. Merchant Robert Fletcher and his wife Anne would complete the gathering, their shipping business having grown wealthy by transporting agricultural products that had been cultivated and harvested by people who would never share in the profits their labor generated. Ruth had begun her preparations in September, ostensibly focusing on the elaborate menu that would demonstrate the Whitmore family's prosperity and hospitality while secretly developing plans that would transform the celebration into something entirely different. The traditional Thanksgiving feast required weeks of advanced preparation, from smoking hams in the plantation's dedicated smokehouse to gathering wild nuts and preserving fruits that would complement the centerpiece turkey. Each dish demanded specific timing and techniques that Ruth had perfected over years of serving the kinds of meals that reinforced social hierarchies, while providing opportunities for the political conversations that shaped regional policy regarding slavery, taxation and territorial expansion. The turkey itself had been selected from the plantation's flock in early November, a magnificent bird weighing nearly 20 pounds that would feed 12 adults with appropriate accompaniments of stuffing, cranberry sauce, sweet potatoes, and the dozens of side dishes that comprised a proper Virginia Thanksgiving table. Ruth had personally overseen the bird's final weeks of feeding, ensuring that its meat would be tender and flavorful when carved by Jeremiah's practiced hand in front of guests who would praise both the food and the skilled slave who had prepared it. The irony of being complimented for feeding people who regarded her as livestock was not lost on Ruth, who had learned to accept such praise with the appropriate mixture of gratitude and humility that her position required. But the turkey would serve purposes beyond mere sustenance. Ruth had discovered that certain herbs, when introduced into poultry during the final days of feeding, could create effects that manifested hours after consumption, symptoms that would be attributed to overindulgence or seasonal illness rather than deliberate intervention. The plants she had chosen grew wild along the riverbank, their properties documented in folk medicine traditions that had been passed down through generations of women who understood that healing and harming often required identical knowledge applied with different intentions. The preparation would be virtually undetectable, requiring no more than the addition of specific seasonings that would complement rather than mask the natural flavors of properly prepared fowl. Jeremiah's evening routine had become as predictable as the plantation's daily schedule, a pattern of behavior that Ruth had studied with the attention of someone whose survival depended on understanding every nuance of her master's character. Each night after supper he retired to his library where he consumed measured amounts of bourbon, while reviewing account books, reading newspapers, and occasionally writing letters to business associates or political allies. The library itself was his private sanctuary, a room lined with leather-bound volumes that proclaimed his education and cultural sophistication, while serving as the command center from which he managed an empire built on stolen labor and systematic oppression. The Thanksgiving celebration would require modifications to these established routines, bringing multiple families together for an extended meal that would last several hours and include formal toasts, lengthy prayers, and the kind of elaborate social rituals that reinforced community bonds while celebrating shared prosperity. Ruth had been planning the evening's logistics for weeks, calculating timing and coordination requirements that would ensure each course emerged from the kitchen at precisely the right temperature, while allowing her to observe the guests' behavior and responses throughout the meal. The dining room's layout would position her near the sideboard where she could monitor conversations while appearing to focus solely on serving duties that rendered her effectively invisible to people accustomed to being attended by human furniture. What the guests would not realize was that Ruth had been studying each family's dietary preferences and personal habits for months, gathering intelligence through conversations with their household staff during church services and market days when slaves from different plantations had opportunities to exchange information. She knew that Colonel Ashford suffered from a weak stomach that required careful attention to spice levels, that Judge Morrison preferred his meat slightly underdone, and that Merchant Fletcher had developed a troublesome cough that might benefit from herbal remedies disguised as thoughtful culinary touches. Such attention to individual preferences would be interpreted as evidence of Ruth's exceptional service rather than reconnaissance for purposes that none of them would survive to understand. The rope that would soon encircle Jeremiah's neck during the Thanksgiving prayer had been taken from the same supply used to secure tobacco bales for shipment to Richmond warehouses, strong hemp fibers that could support considerable weight without stretching or breaking under pressure. Ruth had prepared the ligature with the same meticulous attention to detail that she applied to all her work, ensuring that it would function effectively while appearing to be nothing more than kitchen twine of the type commonly used to truss poultry or secure herb bundles. The weapon had been tested on feed sacks to determine the precise technique required to achieve the desired result with minimal struggle or noise that might alert other family members or guests to the transformation taking place in their midst. The timing would be crucial, requiring Ruth to position herself behind Jeremiah's chair during the traditional pre-meal prayer when all heads would be bowed and eyes closed in a display of Christian gratitude that masked the reality of wealth built on human suffering. The prayer itself typically lasted several minutes, providing sufficient time to complete her work while the other adults remained focused on spiritual contemplation and the children fidgeted with the restrained impatience of young people forced to delay gratification. By the time the final Amen was spoken, Jeremiah Whitmore would have discovered that some prayers receive answers that differ dramatically from what the petitioner expected or desired. The kitchen had been prepared with the thoroughness of a military operation, every detail calculated to support the evening's dual purposes of culinary excellence and strategic elimination. Special attention had been paid to the preparation areas where Ruth had worked alone during the final hours, ensuring that no other household staff would witness the addition of botanical supplements that would complement the main course while serving entirely different objectives than nutritional enhancement. The regular kitchen helpers had been assigned duties that would keep them occupied in other parts of the house during critical preparation periods, a scheduling arrangement that Constance had approved without question since it demonstrated Ruth's commitment to maintaining the highest possible standards for such an important social occasion. The memory crystallized on a Tuesday morning in March of 1839 when Ruth had awakened to the sound of wagon wheels grinding against gravel and the voices of strange men discussing transportation logistics with the detached efficiency of merchants arranging shipment of ordinary cargo. She had rushed from her cabin behind the main house on the Henderson plantation in North Carolina, her bare feet slipping on dew-covered grass as she tried to comprehend the scene unfolding in the yard where her children stood surrounded by other families being torn apart by financial necessity disguised as business acumen. Master Henderson's gambling debts had finally exceeded his ability to maintain his lifestyle through tobacco profits alone, forcing him to liquidate what his creditors euphemistically described as surplus assets. The estate sale had been conducted with military precision, each enslaved person assigned a lot number and appraised value based on age, health, skills and reproductive potential. Ruth had watched in paralyzed horror as James and Mary were evaluated like livestock, their teeth examined, their muscles tested, their futures determined by strangers who saw dollar signs where a mother saw the faces that had given meaning to her existence for 14 and 12 years respectively. The buyers had arrived before dawn, men with calculating eyes and leather account books who moved through the assembled families with the methodical efficiency of predators selecting prey. James, strong for his age and already showing aptitude for field work, attracted immediate interest from a cotton planter expanding operations in Alabama. His sale price of $400 reflected not just his current value, but also his potential for decades of profitable labor in fields where men worked until their bodies failed and their spirits broke under the relentless demands of a crop that fed textile mills in distant cities while enriching owners who never touched soil or breathed cotton dust. Mary's delicate features and household skills had caught the attention of a Charleston merchant seeking domestic help for his wife's increasing social obligations. At 12 she possessed the trainability that wealthy families prized in personal servants, young enough to be molded according to specific preferences while old enough to assume real responsibilities that would justify her purchase price of $350. The merchant had examined her hands for calluses, tested her reading ability and questioned her about cooking and sewing skills while Mary stood silent and trembling, her eyes searching desperately for her mother's face in the crowd of spectators who watched human auctions with the same casual interest they might display at livestock sales. Ruth's own sale had been delayed until afternoon, her reputation as an exceptional cook generating enough competition among potential buyers to drive her price higher than Master Henderson had initially expected. She had been forced to demonstrate her culinary abilities by preparing a complete meal while prospective owners evaluated her performance, discussing her techniques and efficiency as if she were a piece of kitchen equipment rather than a woman whose heart was shattering with each passing hour that brought the final separation closer. The winning bidder Jeremiah Whitmore had praised her light hand with pastry and her knowledge of game preparation, qualities that would enhance his family's reputation for elegant entertaining while providing excellent return on his investment in high-quality human property. The moment of separation had arrived with the efficiency of an execution, 3 different wagons loading their human cargo while families were forbidden the luxury of extended farewells that might discourage future buyers or create emotional scenes that complicated business transactions. Ruth had been permitted 30 seconds to embrace each child, memorizing the feel of their bodies and the scent of their hair while whispering desperate words of love and hope that they would someday find each other again in a world that made such reunions virtually impossible. James had tried to be brave, his 14-year-old shoulders straightening as he promised to take care of himself and find a way to locate his sister and mother when he became old enough to control his own destiny. Mary had clung to Ruth with the desperate strength of someone drowning, her tears soaking into her mother's worn dress while she begged God to perform miracles that would keep their family together despite economic forces more powerful than prayer or love. The child's final words, "I'll never forget you, Mama," had burned themselves into Ruth's memory with the permanence of brands on cattle hides, a promise that sustained her through 8 years of separation while simultaneously torturing her with images of what her children might have become in the hands of strangers who viewed them as investments rather than human beings deserving protection and nurturing. The wagon carrying James had disappeared first, heading west toward Alabama plantations where cotton cultivation demanded endless labor from workers who received nothing but basic sustenance in exchange for lives devoted to enriching others. Ruth had watched until the dust settled and the sound of wheels faded into silence, knowing that her son was traveling toward a future where his strength would be measured in pounds of cotton picked rather than dreams achieved or happiness discovered. The distance between North Carolina and Alabama represented more than geography. It was a chasm that swallowed families and made communication impossible for people who possessed no legal rights and no resources beyond their ability to survive whatever circumstances their owners imposed. Mary's departure had been even more devastating, the Charleston-bound wagon carrying Ruth's daughter toward a life of domestic servitude in a city where her value would be determined by her ability to anticipate the needs of women who had never known physical labor or financial insecurity. The merchant's wife had specific requirements for personal servants, expectations that would shape Mary's daily existence around the comfort and convenience of people who would never acknowledge her humanity or consider her welfare beyond its impact on their own satisfaction. Ruth had tried to imagine her daughter navigating the complex social dynamics of wealthy households where enslaved people were expected to be simultaneously invisible and indispensable, always available but never intrusive. The years that followed had been marked by a grief so profound that it had physically altered Ruth's appearance, adding lines to her face and gray to her hair, while hollowing out spaces inside her chest where love for her children had once resided. She had written letters that would never be sent, addresses unknown and literacy among enslaved people often punished rather than encouraged. She had saved small amounts of money when possible, thinking vaguely of somehow purchasing her children's freedom without any realistic understanding of how such transactions might be accomplished, or what obstacles would prevent their completion. She had prayed with the desperate fervor of someone seeking divine intervention in situations where human solutions appeared impossible, but gradually, grief had transformed into something harder and more dangerous than simple sorrow. Ruth had begun studying the Whitmore family with the clinical attention of someone gathering intelligence for purposes that remained undefined but definitely hostile. She had learned Jeremiah's patterns of behavior, Constance's social ambitions, and the developing personalities of children who would someday inherit both the plantation and the attitudes that made its operation possible. She had observed the casual cruelty that characterized interactions between masters and enslaved people, noting how quickly kindness could turn to violence when authority was questioned or efficiency fell below expected standards. The kitchen had become her laboratory, a place where she experimented with recipes while simultaneously learning about the properties of plants that grew throughout Virginia's countryside. Her herb garden had expanded beyond culinary necessities to include specimens whose medicinal properties intersected with more dangerous applications for those who understood botanical chemistry. She had cultivated relationships with enslaved people from neighboring plantations, gathering information about their masters' habits and weaknesses while maintaining the facade of someone whose interests extended no further than comparing recipes and sharing household management techniques. Knowledge had accumulated like sediment in a riverbed, layer upon layer of information about vulnerabilities and opportunities that might someday prove useful for purposes that Ruth had not yet fully acknowledged even to herself. She had learned which neighbors suffered from chronic illnesses that affected their appetites and digestion, which families maintained traditions that brought them together for regular celebrations, and which social connections bound the plantation community together in networks of mutual dependence and shared interests. Such information appeared harmless when gathered gradually through normal social interactions, but its potential applications extended far beyond innocent curiosity about community dynamics. The Whitmore family's financial situation had become increasingly precarious during recent years, tobacco prices declining while expenses for maintaining their social position continued to rise, Jeremiah had begun borrowing against future harvests, a practice that required optimistic assumptions about weather conditions and market demand that might not materialize as expected. The pressure had made him more demanding and less tolerant of anything that interfered with plantation efficiency, creating an atmosphere where small mistakes could trigger explosive anger and physical punishment that left permanent marks on bodies and spirits alike. Constance had responded to financial stress by intensifying her efforts to maintain social connections that might provide support during difficult times, organizing elaborate dinner parties and charitable events that demonstrated the family's continued prosperity while creating opportunities to strengthen relationships with other planter families. These gatherings required increasingly sophisticated menus and flawless execution that showcased Ruth's abilities while reinforcing the impression that the Whitmores remained among Virginia's most successful plantation families despite underlying economic vulnerabilities that could not be acknowledged publicly. The children had absorbed the tension that permeated the household, their behavior reflecting the anxiety and uncertainty that their parents attempted to hide behind facades of confidence and control. Benjamin had become more aggressive in his interactions with enslaved people, perhaps sensing that his inheritance might be less secure than previously assumed and compensating with displays of authority that bordered on cruelty. Hannah had grown increasingly focused on her engagement to the Fletcher boy, understanding instinctively that marriage into another planter family might provide security that her father's tobacco fields could no longer guarantee. Young Samuel remained the most unpredictable family member, his childish moods shifting between genuine affection for Ruth and disturbing echoes of his father's casual brutality toward people he had been taught to regard as property rather than human beings. The boy still sought comfort from Ruth when nightmares troubled his sleep or when his father's discipline seemed excessively harsh, but these moments of vulnerability were becoming less frequent as Samuel learned that masters did not show weakness to slaves and that emotional connections across racial lines were incompatible with the power dynamics that sustained plantation society. The approaching Thanksgiving celebration represented both opportunity and enormous risk, a gathering that would bring together multiple planter families whose elimination could destabilize the regional power structure while potentially exposing Ruth to suspicion if her actions appeared too coordinated or sophisticated for someone supposedly incapable of complex planning. The challenge lay in creating circumstances that would appear entirely natural while achieving results that served purposes none of the participants would survive to understand. Success would require perfect timing, flawless execution and the kind of luck that might be interpreted as divine intervention by people who believed that God favored those who prospered from other people's suffering. Ruth had spent weeks studying the dietary preferences and personal habits of each family that would attend the Thanksgiving feast, gathering intelligence through conversations with their household staff and careful observation during church services and community gatherings. Colonel Ashford suffered from chronic digestive problems that required careful attention to spice levels and food combinations, creating opportunities for botanical interventions that would be attributed to unfortunate reactions rather than deliberate poisoning. Judge Morrison's preference for rare meat and strong flavors could mask the addition of substances that would manifest their effects hours after consumption, allowing Ruth to maintain her facade of devoted service while achieving objectives that had nothing to do with culinary excellence. The Fletchers presented the most interesting challenge, their merchant background having exposed them to exotic foods and foreign spices that might require more sophisticated approaches than traditional Virginia plantation fare. Robert Fletcher's recent respiratory problems suggested vulnerabilities that could be exploited through airborne irritants disguised as aromatic seasonings, while his wife Anne's social ambitions made her eager to sample every dish in order to evaluate Ruth's techniques for possible replication in her own household. Such enthusiasm for culinary experimentation would work to Ruth's advantage, ensuring that her special preparations received the attention they deserved while maintaining plausible deniability regarding any unfortunate consequences that might follow. The turkey that would serve as the meal's centerpiece had been selected from the plantation's flock with care that extended far beyond considerations of size and flavor. Ruth had spent the bird's final weeks of life introducing specific herbs into its diet, plants whose properties would be concentrated in the meat while remaining virtually undetectable to casual inspection. The technique required precise timing and careful measurement, too little influence producing no effect while too much might create obvious symptoms that would arouse suspicion before the evening's other objectives could be achieved. The balance between effectiveness and subtlety represented the difference between success and discovery, between justice and execution. Jeremiah's evening routine in the library had provided Ruth with detailed knowledge of his habits and vulnerabilities, information gathered through 8 years of bringing him coffee and cleaning his private sanctuary while he conducted business correspondence and reviewed financial records. She knew which nights he drank more heavily than usual, which topics of conversation agitated him sufficiently to affect his sleep patterns, and which physical positions he assumed when fatigue or alcohol consumption left him vulnerable to approaches that would be impossible under normal circumstances. The library itself had been mapped with the precision of a military strategist, every piece of furniture and potential obstacle catalogued for future reference. The rope that would soon encircle Jeremiah's throat during the Thanksgiving prayer had been prepared with the same attention to detail that Ruth applied to all her work, tested for strength and flexibility while being disguised as ordinary kitchen supplies that would arouse no suspicion if discovered among her regular equipment. The ligature had been treated with substances that would ensure quick unconsciousness while minimizing the physical struggle that might alert other family members or guests to the transformation taking place at the head of their dining table. Even death would be administered with the efficiency and skill that had made Ruth indispensable to the Whitmore household throughout 8 years of faithful service. The dining room's layout had been studied and memorized, every angle and sightline calculated to determine optimal positioning for activities that would remain invisible to other participants until it was too late for intervention or escape. The massive mahogany table would seat 12 adults comfortably, with children's places arranged to keep younger family members safely distant from conversations about politics and business that might prove educational in ways their parents would prefer to avoid. Ruth's assigned position near the sideboard would provide perfect access to Jeremiah's chair while maintaining the appearance of someone focused entirely on serving duties that rendered her effectively invisible to people accustomed to being attended by human furniture. The evening's timeline had been planned with military precision, each course timed to emerge from the kitchen at precisely the right temperature while allowing Ruth to monitor guest reactions and adjust her tactics as circumstances required. The traditional Thanksgiving prayer would occur after all participants had been seated but before the first course was served, creating a window of opportunity when all attention would be focused on spiritual contemplation rather than the activities of servants who were expected to remain motionless and silent during religious observances. The prayer itself typically lasted 3 to 4 minutes, providing ample time to complete the most critical phase of the evening's objectives while maintaining perfect cover for actions that would appear entirely natural to anyone who happened to observe them. What none of the guests could anticipate was that their hostess had been planning this gathering for purposes that extended far beyond traditional hospitality or seasonal celebration. Ruth had transformed the Thanksgiving feast into an elaborate trap that would eliminate multiple threats while demonstrating capabilities that contradicted every assumption about enslaved people's intelligence, planning abilities, and potential for sophisticated resistance. The irony was exquisite. Families who had built their prosperity by underestimating the humanity of their workforce would discover too late that their greatest vulnerability lay in their inability to recognize the person who served their meals as someone capable of strategic thinking and methodical revenge. The kitchen preparations had reached their final stage, with special attention paid to timing and coordination that would ensure each element of the meal achieved its intended purpose while maintaining the highest standards of culinary excellence that the Whitmore family's reputation demanded. Ruth had worked alone during the most critical phases, ensuring that no other household staff would witness the addition of botanical supplements that would transform ordinary ingredients into vehicles for justice that had been delayed for 8 years but would finally be served at precisely the right temperature to achieve maximum effectiveness. The catalyst arrived with the October tobacco harvest, when Jeremiah announced during the evening meal that he had accepted an offer from a Charleston buyer to purchase 3 of the plantation's most skilled field hands, including Daniel's younger brother Moses and Sarah's cousin Peter. The transaction would provide necessary capital to service mounting debts while demonstrating to creditors that the Whitmore family remained capable of making difficult business decisions when circumstances required pragmatic solutions to financial challenges. The sale would take place immediately after the Thanksgiving celebration, giving the affected families time to prepare for separations that would scatter them across different states with no possibility of maintaining contact or connection. Ruth had been serving coffee when the announcement was made, her hands steady as she poured steaming liquid into delicate china cups while her mind processed the implications of decisions that would destroy more families for the sake of mathematical calculations on ledger pages. Moses was barely 18, strong and intelligent, with a wife named Rebecca and an infant daughter whose first steps would be taken without her father's guidance or protection. Peter had recently married one of the kitchen helpers, their union blessed by informal ceremonies that carried no legal recognition but held deep emotional significance for people whose relationships existed at the mercy of economic forces beyond their control. The casual manner in which Jeremiah discussed the upcoming sales, his tone suggesting no more emotional weight than decisions about which tobacco fields to plant the following spring, crystallized Ruth's understanding that the Whitmore family would continue treating human beings as disposable property until someone forced them to confront the consequences of their choices. The upcoming Thanksgiving feast would provide the perfect opportunity to demonstrate that enslaved people possessed capabilities that their masters had never imagined and motivations powerful enough to overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles when justice demanded satisfaction. That night Ruth had lain awake in her small room above the kitchen, listening to the sounds of people in the slave quarters processing news that would reshape their lives according to financial necessities that they had no power to influence or escape. Quiet conversations drifted through the November air, voices discussing practical arrangements for families that would be torn apart by mourning wagons carrying human cargo toward unknown destinations. The community that had developed among the plantation's enslaved population would be damaged permanently by sales that served no purpose beyond converting human suffering into currency that could be applied to tobacco market fluctuations and lifestyle maintenance expenses. The decision had formed in Ruth's mind with the clarity of morning light cutting through darkness, transforming months of vague planning into specific objectives that would require precise execution and perfect timing. The Thanksgiving celebration would become something entirely different from what Jeremiah intended, a feast that would eliminate threats while demonstrating the kinds of capabilities that slaveholders never suspected existed among people they had trained themselves to see as livestock rather than human beings capable of sophisticated planning and methodical revenge. Ruth had begun the final phase of preparation with the systematic thoroughness that characterized all her work, checking and rechecking every element that would contribute to the evening's success while maintaining the facade of devoted service that had protected her for 8 years. The kitchen became her headquarters, a command center where ordinary cooking activities concealed preparations for operations that would transform Virginia's plantation society in ways that none of the participants would survive to understand or prevent. The herb garden provided the primary arsenal for her campaign, plants whose properties she had studied with the dedication of someone whose survival depended on understanding every nuance of botanical chemistry and practical application. Foxglove grew abundantly along the river's edge, its beautiful purple flowers concealing cardiac glycosides that could stop hearts when administered in appropriate concentrations. Pokeweed flourished in disturbed soil near the tobacco barns, its roots containing saponins that would cause severe gastrointestinal distress several hours after consumption, symptoms that would be attributed to overindulgence rather than deliberate intervention. Elderberry shrubs dotted the landscape, their berries safe when properly prepared but potentially dangerous when combined with certain other compounds that could amplify their effects in ways that would overwhelm digestive systems already stressed by rich holiday foods. Water hemlock grew in marshy areas where the James River created seasonal wetlands, its toxins among the most potent available to someone with the knowledge to harvest and prepare them safely while avoiding personal exposure to substances that could prove as dangerous to the preparer as to the intended targets. The turkey that would serve as the evening's centerpiece had been receiving Ruth's special attention for 3 weeks, its diet supplemented with carefully measured amounts of plant materials that would concentrate in the bird's tissues while remaining virtually undetectable to casual inspection. The technique required precise timing and expert knowledge of avian physiology, ensuring that the desired compounds would be present in sufficient quantities to affect consumers while avoiding concentrations that might alter the meat's appearance or flavor in ways that could arouse suspicion before the meal was consumed. Jeremiah's evening routine had been studied with the attention to detail that military strategists applied to enemy fortifications, every pattern and vulnerability catalogued for potential exploitation during moments when his guard would be lowered by alcohol consumption and social obligation. The library where he conducted business represented his most secure environment, a private sanctuary where he felt completely safe from any threats that might penetrate the plantation's carefully maintained facade of prosperity and control. That sense of security would become a fatal weakness when someone he trusted gained access to spaces where his defenses were non-existent. The dining room's layout had been memorized with architectural precision, every angle and sightline calculated to determine optimal positioning for activities that would remain invisible to other participants until circumstances made concealment unnecessary. The massive table could accommodate 12 adults with formal place settings that demonstrated the family's refinement while creating distance between participants that would prevent immediate intervention if unexpected events required rapid response. Ruth's assigned position near the sideboard would provide perfect access to every guest while maintaining the appearance of someone focused entirely on service duties that rendered her effectively invisible to people who had never learned to see enslaved individuals as potential threats. The rope that would soon transform Jeremiah's Thanksgiving prayer into his final words had been prepared with the same meticulous attention that Ruth applied to all her culinary creations, tested for strength and flexibility while being treated with substances that would ensure rapid unconsciousness and minimal physical struggle. The ligature appeared to be ordinary kitchen twine of the type commonly used for trussing poultry or securing herb bundles, innocent enough to escape notice among the many implements required for elaborate meal preparation while serving purposes that none of the evening's participants would anticipate or survive. Benjamin's recent behavior had provided additional motivation for Ruth's expanding objectives, the 16-year-old's increasing cruelty toward enslaved people reflecting attitudes that would only worsen as he assumed greater responsibility for plantation operations. The boy had begun accompanying his father to slave auctions and business meetings, learning to evaluate human beings with the same detached expertise that previous generations had applied to livestock purchases. His natural aptitude for the family business included asking intelligent questions about labor management while displaying casual brutality that suggested he would someday exceed his father's achievements in both prosperity and systematic oppression. The young man's treatment of Moses during recent weeks had been particularly revealing, using his emerging authority to impose punishments that served no purpose beyond demonstrating his power over someone whose age and strength might otherwise have commanded respect. Benjamin had forced Moses to work extended hours without additional food, had assigned him the most unpleasant tasks available, and had threatened him with sale to more brutal masters if his attitude showed any signs of resentment or resistance. Such behavior indicated that Benjamin would require permanent elimination rather than the temporary setbacks that might suffice for less dangerous members of his family. Hannah's engagement to young Robert Fletcher had created additional complications that required careful consideration during the planning process. The marriage would unite two planter families whose combined resources and political connections could pose significant threats to any broader campaign against the regional power structure that sustained plantation society. The wedding was scheduled for the following spring, providing a deadline that made immediate action necessary if the alliance was to be prevented through permanent rather than temporary solutions to problems that would only grow more difficult to address as time passed. The Fletcher family's arrival for the Thanksgiving celebration would provide opportunities to evaluate potential future targets while gathering intelligence about their household routines and personal vulnerabilities. Robert Fletcher's merchant background had exposed him to diverse business practices in foreign contexts that might make him more observant than typical plantation owners regarding unusual circumstances or suspicious patterns. His wife Anne's social ambitions included hosting elaborate gatherings that showcased their prosperity while strengthening political alliances that protected their shared interests from external interference or internal challenges. Constance's response to mounting financial pressures had revealed character traits that Ruth had not previously recognized: desperation manifesting as increased demands for perfection in household management while simultaneously reducing resources available for maintaining previous standards. The mistress had begun questioning expenditures that she had never noticed before, scrutinizing Ruth's
requests for expensive ingredients while expecting menus that would impress guests without acknowledging the mathematical impossibility of achieving superior results with inferior materials. Such contradictions created stress throughout the household while providing Ruth with additional justifications for actions that would eliminate sources of unrealistic expectations and systematic oppression. Young Samuel's developing personality remained the most unpredictable element in Ruth's calculations, the 11-year-old's genuine affection for her competing with lessons about racial hierarchy that his family considered essential for his proper development. The child still sought comfort from Ruth when nightmares troubled his sleep or when his father's discipline seemed excessively harsh, but these moments of vulnerability were becoming less frequent as Samuel learned that emotional connections across racial lines were incompatible with his destiny as a master of human property. His elimination would prevent the transformation of innocence into the casual cruelty that characterized adult members of his family. The guest list for the Thanksgiving celebration had been finalized with invitations extended to families whose elimination would create maximum disruption to the regional network of plantation owners who controlled Virginia's political and economic systems. Colonel Ashford's military background and political connections made him influential beyond his individual plantation operations, his opinions carrying weight in legislative discussions about territorial expansion and federal policies affecting slavery. Judge Morrison's legal expertise had been essential in drafting contracts and regulations that ensured human chattel remained profitable property rather than people with rights that might interfere with business operations. The timing of the evening's events had been calculated with precision that would have impressed professional military strategists, each phase designed to achieve specific objectives while maintaining perfect cover for activities that would appear entirely natural to anyone who might observe them. The traditional Thanksgiving prayer would provide the crucial window of opportunity when all participants would be focused on spiritual contemplation rather than the movements of servants who were expected to remain invisible during religious observances. The blessing itself typically lasted several minutes, creating ample time for Ruth to complete the most critical element of her plan while maintaining perfect concealment from other family members and guests. The kitchen staff had been assigned duties that would keep them occupied in other areas of the house during the final preparation phases, ensuring that Ruth could work alone while adding botanical supplements that would transform ordinary ingredients into vehicles for justice that had been delayed for 8 years. The scheduling arrangements had been approved by Constance without question, the mistress interpreting Ruth's desire for solitary work as evidence of professional pride rather than recognition that some activities required complete privacy to avoid witnesses who might complicate future operations. The arsenal of plant-based compounds that Ruth had accumulated represented months of careful harvesting and preparation, substances gathered from locations throughout the plantation's extensive acreage while maintaining the appearance of someone collecting ordinary culinary herbs and seasonal decorations. Each specimen had been processed according to traditional techniques that concentrated active compounds while eliminating elements that might interfere with desired effects or create detectable traces that could expose the artificial nature of symptoms that would be attributed to natural causes. Jeremiah's recent behavior had provided additional intelligence about his personal routines and physical vulnerabilities, information gathered through years of bringing him coffee and maintaining his private spaces while he conducted business correspondence and consumed the bourbon that dulled his awareness of approaching threats. His increasing alcohol consumption had made him predictable in ways that sober caution might have prevented, creating opportunities for approaches that would be impossible under normal circumstances when his guard remained elevated against potential challenges to his authority. The library where Jeremiah spent his evenings had been mapped with the thoroughness of someone planning military operations, every piece of furniture and potential obstacle catalogued for future reference during activities that would require rapid movement and precise positioning. The room's layout provided excellent acoustical isolation from other parts of the house, ensuring that any sounds generated during critical moments would remain undetected by family members or guests who might otherwise investigate unusual disturbances that interrupted their seasonal celebrations. The rope that would soon encircle Jeremiah's throat had been tested on feed sacks and fence posts to determine the exact technique required for rapid effectiveness with minimal physical struggle that might alert other participants to events that needed to remain undetected until their completion. Made intervention impossible. The ligature had been treated with plant extracts that would accelerate unconsciousness while reducing the victim's ability to resist or call for help during the brief moments when awareness remained possible. Ruth's own preparation had included mental rehearsals of every movement and contingency, practicing the timing and coordination required to execute complex plans while maintaining the appearance of devoted service that had protected her throughout 8 years of careful observation and patient planning. The transformation from grieving mother to methodical strategist had occurred gradually, grief crystallizing into something harder and more dangerous than simple sorrow while she learned to weaponize the very invisibility that her masters had imposed upon her as a condition of survival. The evening's success would depend on perfect execution of multiple coordinated activities, each element timed to support the others while creating circumstances that would appear entirely natural to any investigation that might follow. The challenges were enormous, but Ruth had spent months preparing for every contingency while developing capabilities that contradicted every assumption about enslaved people's intelligence and potential for sophisticated resistance against seemingly overwhelming power structures that controlled every aspect of their existence. November 25th dawned gray and cold with frost covering the tobacco fields like a silver shroud that spoke of winter's approach and the kind of endings that came naturally with changing seasons. The kitchen house had been warm since before sunrise, Ruth working by candlelight to complete preparations that would transform an ordinary Thanksgiving feast into something that Riverside County would discuss in whispered conversations for decades to come. Steam rose from copper pots where cranberry sauce simmered with additions that had nothing to do with traditional recipes, while the massive turkey rested on the preparation table, its golden skin concealing modifications that would serve purposes entirely different from culinary excellence. The dining room had been prepared with the kind of attention to detail that reflected 8 years of experience in serving Virginia's plantation aristocracy, crystal goblets catching morning light while fine china displayed the Whitmore family crest that would soon represent nothing more than historical curiosity. Ruth had positioned each place setting with mathematical precision, ensuring that specific guests would receive specially prepared portions while maintaining the appearance of random service that characterized elegant entertaining. The massive mahogany table gleamed under polish applied by hands that would soon demonstrate capabilities that none of the evening's participants had ever imagined possible. Jeremiah had awakened in excellent spirits, the prospect of entertaining neighboring families providing welcome distraction from financial concerns that had dominated his thoughts throughout the difficult autumn months. He spent the morning reviewing account books and correspondence while consuming coffee that Ruth prepared with her usual care, the familiar routine masking the fact that this would be the final day of his existence. His satisfaction with the household arrangements reflected his complete confidence in Ruth's abilities, trust that had developed over years of flawless service while concealing motivations that extended far beyond devotion to culinary excellence. Constance had devoted her morning to final preparations that would ensure the evening's success as a social event, reviewing seating arrangements and conversation topics while paying particular attention to details that would demonstrate the family's continued prosperity despite underlying financial vulnerabilities. Her complete reliance on Ruth's expertise in household management reflected the kind of dependence that wealthy families develop toward enslaved people whose skills made their lifestyle possible while remaining invisible to consciousness that preferred not to acknowledge such uncomfortable realities. The children had spent the morning in restless anticipation of the evening's festivities, Benjamin practicing his role as future plantation master while Hannah focused on impressing the Fletcher family with her accomplishments as a potential daughter-in-law. Young Samuel remained somewhat isolated from these adult concerns, his innocence providing temporary protection from the full implications of the society he would inherit if circumstances permitted his survival beyond the approaching evening's events. Colonel Ashford and his wife Elizabeth arrived at precisely 4 o'clock, their carriage bearing gifts of imported wine and seasonal decorations that demonstrated their appreciation for Whitmore hospitality while reinforcing social connections that bound Virginia's planter families together in networks of mutual support and shared interests. The colonel's military bearing and political connections made him influential beyond his individual plantation operations, his elimination promising to create disruptions that would weaken the entire regional power structure that sustained the plantation system through coordinated resistance to external challenges. Judge Morrison and his wife Catherine followed shortly afterward, their arrival accompanied by legal documents and business correspondence that would require Jeremiah's attention during the evening's social interactions. The judge's expertise in drafting contracts and regulations that protected slaveholder interests had made him indispensable to the regional community, his death promising to create legal vulnerabilities that might be exploited by forces seeking to undermine the systematic oppression that characterized Virginia's agricultural economy. The Fletcher family completed the gathering, Robert and Anne bringing their merchant perspective to conversations about territorial expansion and market development that would shape regional policy regarding slavery and economic development. Their daughter's engagement to Hannah had created alliance opportunities that would strengthen planter resistance to abolition movements while expanding commercial networks that made human trafficking more profitable and efficient. The elimination of such partnerships would disrupt coordination efforts while creating uncertainty about future political developments. Ruth had observed these arrivals from the kitchen house, noting the easy confidence and casual conversation that characterized people who had never questioned their right to make decisions about other human beings' lives. Their comfort and security would soon be transformed into confusion and terror as they discovered that their most fundamental assumptions about power and control were dangerously incorrect. The irony was perfect. Families who had built their prosperity by underestimating enslaved people's humanity would learn too late that their greatest vulnerability lay in their inability to recognize threats that had been developing under their supervision for years. The afternoon had passed with social rituals that reinforced community bonds while providing Ruth with final opportunities to study her targets and confirm that all preparations remained on schedule. She had served refreshments with perfect grace while mentally rehearsing the timing and coordination that would transform ordinary service duties into something entirely different when circumstances permitted the revelation of capabilities that contradicted every assumption about enslaved people's intelligence and potential for sophisticated resistance. The formal dinner began at 6 o'clock with guests gathering in the dining room where candlelight created an atmosphere of warmth and elegance that masked the approaching transformation of celebration into something that would haunt survivors for the remainder of their abbreviated lives. Ruth had positioned herself near the sideboard where she could monitor all participants while maintaining perfect access to Jeremiah's chair during the traditional blessing that would provide cover for activities that needed to remain undetected until their completion made concealment unnecessary. Jeremiah rose to offer the Thanksgiving prayer with the confidence of someone whose authority had never been seriously challenged, his voice carrying across the room while all heads bowed in displays of Christian devotion that concealed the reality of wealth built on systematic oppression and human suffering. The prayer's familiar words about gratitude and divine providence created acoustic cover for movements that would have attracted immediate attention under normal circumstances. Ruth's approach masked by the rustle of clothing and shifting chairs as guests settled into positions of spiritual contemplation. The rope slipped around Jeremiah's throat with the silence of morning mist, his prayer continuing for several seconds before surprise and confusion interrupted the familiar recitation that had marked thousands of family meals throughout his lifetime. Ruth's grip tightened with the steady pressure that she had practiced on feed sacks and fence posts, the ligature cutting off blood flow to his brain while preventing the vocal responses that might have alerted other participants to events that required complete secrecy until their successful completion. Jeremiah's hands rose toward his neck in instinctive response to the unexpected constriction, but Ruth had anticipated such reactions and positioned herself to control his movements while maintaining the appearance of someone adjusting serving pieces or rearranging table settings. The other guests remained focused on their own spiritual contemplation, eyes closed and thoughts directed toward expressions of gratitude that would soon transform into final prayers for mercy that would receive no divine intervention. The master's struggles weakened rapidly as oxygen deprivation achieved its intended effects, his body becoming heavy in Ruth's supporting embrace while she whispered the same prayers that had sustained her through 8 years of grief and patient planning. The irony was exquisite. Jeremiah Whitmore was dying during a prayer of thanksgiving, his life ending while surrounded by family and friends who remained completely unaware that their host was experiencing permanent relief from all earthly concerns and responsibilities. Benjamin noticed his father's stillness first, the 16-year-old's eyes opening to discover Jeremiah slumped forward in his chair while Ruth stood beside him with hands positioned as if checking his comfort or adjusting his posture. The boy's initial assumption was that his father had suffered some kind of medical episode, perhaps a heart attack or stroke brought on by the excitement of entertaining multiple families during financially stressful circumstances that had affected his health throughout the difficult autumn months. Ruth's performance of concern and confusion was flawless, her voice breaking as she called for help while apparently attempting to revive her master through techniques that would appear entirely appropriate to witnesses who understood nothing about the actual cause of his collapse. Her cries of distress brought immediate responses from guests who abandoned their prayers to assist in what appeared to be a medical emergency requiring prompt attention from people with more expertise than a household servant could provide. Dr. Henderson was summoned from Cedar Falls while the guests attempted to determine what had caused Jeremiah's sudden collapse during what should have been a peaceful family celebration. Their examination revealed no obvious signs of trauma or illness, his body appearing to have simply surrendered to forces that defied medical explanation or understanding. The physician's eventual arrival confirmed that Jeremiah Whitmore had died from apparent heart failure, a diagnosis that satisfied everyone's need for rational explanation while concealing the true cause of death from people who lacked the imagination to consider alternatives that contradicted their assumptions about servant loyalty and devotion. The evening's remaining events unfolded with the inevitability of a carefully orchestrated performance, each guest consuming specially prepared portions that would manifest their effects during the journey home or in the privacy of their own bedrooms where symptoms would be attributed to grief over their host's unexpected death rather than deliberate intervention by someone they had never learned to see as a potential threat. Ruth continued her performance of devoted service while internally cataloging the success of preparations that had required months of careful planning and patient execution. Colonel Ashford began experiencing respiratory distress approximately 2 hours after consuming the specially seasoned turkey, his chronic digestive problems providing perfect cover for reactions that his family attributed to emotional stress combined with rich food that his weakened system could not properly process. The drive back to his plantation became a race against time that ended in failure, his body surrendering to botanical compounds that had been designed to appear entirely natural while achieving effects that served purposes none of the evening's participants would survive to understand. Judge Morrison's preference for rare meat had made him an ideal candidate for preparations that concentrated their effects in undercooked portions, his symptoms manifesting as apparent food poisoning that his wife initially attributed to kitchen accidents or seasonal illness that struck unfortunate victims during holiday celebrations. The legal expertise that had made him indispensable to the regional plantation community would be buried with his body, creating vulnerabilities that might eventually be exploited by forces seeking to challenge the systematic oppression that he had helped design and implement. The Fletcher family's elimination proved more complex due to their merchant background and exposure to exotic foods that might have made them more observant regarding unusual flavors or suspicious reactions among other guests. However, Ruth's preparations had been sophisticated enough to overcome such potential difficulties, their deaths occurring in stages that prevented any survivor from recognizing patterns that might have exposed the artificial nature of circumstances that appeared entirely coincidental to people who possessed no reason to suspect deliberate intervention. Constance's reaction to her husband's death provided Ruth with opportunities to demonstrate the kind of devoted service that had characterized their relationship throughout 8 years of mutual dependence. The widow's grief making her even more reliant on household staff who could manage practical arrangements while she struggled to process losses that threatened to destroy everything she had worked to build and maintain. Ruth's comfort and support during this crisis would be remembered by any potential investigators as evidence of loyalty that contradicted theories about servant involvement in events that defied rational explanation. The children's responses reflected their different ages and levels of understanding regarding the evening's implications for their future security and social position. Benjamin's attempts to assume his father's authority created opportunities for Ruth to guide his decisions in directions that would serve her purposes while appearing to provide the kind of experienced advice that the family had always valued from their most trusted household staff. Hannah's engagement to young Fletcher had been terminated by circumstances that appeared entirely natural, eliminating alliance opportunities that might have strengthened planter resistance to changing political circumstances. Young Samuel's grief was perhaps the most genuine among the family responses, his affection for Ruth providing emotional support that helped him process losses that exceeded his ability to understand or accept. The child's innocence created moral complexities that Ruth acknowledged while maintaining her commitment to preventing his transformation into another generation of systematic oppression that would perpetuate cycles of suffering for people who deserved better futures than plantation society could provide. The investigation that followed would prove as ineffective as Ruth had anticipated, authorities finding no evidence of deliberate intervention in deaths that appeared to result from natural causes affecting multiple families during the same evening. The coincidental timing raised questions that could not be answered satisfactorily, but the absence of obvious connections between victims who had consumed different foods prepared by different hands made conspiracy theories impossible to support with evidence that would satisfy legal requirements for criminal prosecution. Ruth's position as the surviving household expert made her indispensable during the estate settlement process, her knowledge of plantation operations and family preferences ensuring that she would remain at Whitmore Hall regardless of whatever arrangements were made for the property's future management. The trust that had protected her throughout 8 years of patient planning would continue to provide cover for activities that served purposes beyond household management. Her reputation for loyalty and competence creating opportunities for expanded operations that might benefit other enslaved communities throughout the region. The success of her Thanksgiving campaign had demonstrated capabilities that contradicted every assumption about enslaved people's potential for sophisticated resistance, proving that systematic oppression contained vulnerabilities that could be exploited by those who possessed the knowledge, patience and motivation required to identify and attack structural weaknesses that plantation owners had never imagined might exist. The legend that would grow from these events would inspire future generations while providing practical lessons about resistance techniques that could be adapted to local circumstances and opportunities. The herb garden behind the kitchen house would continue producing the botanical resources that had made Ruth's success possible, her accumulated knowledge becoming a legacy that could be shared with others who possessed similar motivations and access to the plants that grew throughout Virginia's countryside. The transformation from grieving mother to methodical strategist had created capabilities that could be replicated by anyone who understood that invisible people possessed advantages that visible enemies could never overcome. Ruth Caldwell had balanced scales that had been weighted against her people for far too long, demonstrating that justice delayed was not necessarily justice denied when the right person acquired the right knowledge at the right moment. The Thanksgiving feast of 1847 would be remembered as the evening when Virginia's plantation society learned that their greatest vulnerability lay in their inability to recognize the humanity of people they had trained themselves to see as property, rather than potential threats to everything they had built on stolen labor and systematic cruelty. The winter of 1848 transformed Riverside County into a landscape of whispered conversations and unanswered questions, where 5 prominent families had been reduced to memories that people discussed in hushed tones when they thought no one was listening. The snow that blanketed the tobacco fields created a silence that seemed to muffle more than just sound, as if nature itself had conspired to cover evidence of events that defied explanation while protecting secrets that would reshape Virginia's plantation society in ways that no one could have anticipated. Ruth Caldwell maintained her position at Whitmore Hall through the complex legal proceedings that followed the simultaneous deaths of so many influential community members, her expertise in household management making her indispensable to attorneys and executors who struggled to untangle financial arrangements that had depended on personal relationships now permanently severed. The trust she had cultivated over 8 years of devoted service provided perfect protection against suspicions that might have fallen on someone whose loyalty appeared less absolute, or whose capabilities seemed more threatening to people who preferred their servants invisible and predictable. The estate settlement process revealed financial vulnerabilities that Jeremiah had concealed from his family, tobacco market fluctuations and mounting debts creating circumstances that would have forced the sale of significant portions of the plantation even if he had survived to confront the mathematical realities of declining revenues and increasing expenses. Ruth's intimate knowledge of household accounts and operational details made her invaluable to legal representatives who needed to understand complex arrangements between families whose patriarchs could no longer explain decisions that had seemed reasonable when made but appeared questionable in retrospect. Constance Whitmore's dependency on Ruth's guidance had intensified during the months following her husband's death, the widow's grief and confusion creating opportunities for subtle influence that shaped decisions about property management and financial planning in directions that served purposes beyond immediate household concerns. Ruth's suggestions about which creditors should be paid first and which obligations might be renegotiated reflected her understanding of regional power structures that extended far beyond the boundaries of any single plantation, knowledge that she had accumulated through years of careful observation and patient analysis. The children's reactions to their altered circumstances provided Ruth with additional opportunities to demonstrate the kind of devoted care that had characterized her relationship with the family throughout their years together. Benjamin's attempts to assume his father's authority had been complicated by legal restrictions that prevented minors from making binding decisions about estate management, creating frustrations that Ruth addressed through patient guidance and practical advice that helped him navigate unfamiliar responsibilities while learning lessons that would shape his character in directions that served broader purposes than immediate family interests. Hannah's engagement to young Robert Fletcher had been terminated by circumstances that appeared entirely natural, eliminating alliance opportunities that might have strengthened connections between plantation families while creating inheritance complications that benefited Ruth's long-term objectives. The girl's grief over losing both her father and her intended husband had made her particularly receptive to comfort and guidance from the woman who had been a constant presence throughout her childhood, trust that Ruth cultivated carefully while providing emotional support that helped Hannah process losses that exceeded her ability to understand completely. Young Samuel's innocence remained both a moral challenge and a practical opportunity, the 11-year-old's genuine affection for Ruth creating emotional bonds that transcended the racial hierarchies his family had taught him to respect and maintain. His questions about death and justice reflected a developing conscience that Ruth could influence through careful conversation and patient explanation, planting seeds that might eventually grow into understanding that contradicted everything his social position was supposed to teach him about human worth and natural hierarchy. The regional impact of the Thanksgiving deaths had extended far beyond the immediate families affected, creating power vacuums that disrupted established networks of political and economic cooperation among Virginia's plantation elite. Colonel Ashford's military connections and Judge Morrison's legal expertise had been essential components of organized resistance to abolition movements, their elimination weakening systematic efforts to protect slavery through coordinated political action and judicial interpretation that favored property rights over human rights. The Fletcher family's merchant operations had provided crucial links between Virginia's agricultural economy and international markets that depended on slave-produced commodities, their deaths creating uncertainties about trade relationships that had sustained regional prosperity while connecting local plantation owners to global networks of exploitation and profit. The disruption of such commercial arrangements created opportunities for competitors who might approach business relationships with different priorities and perhaps different moral perspectives regarding the sources of their wealth. Other plantation families had responded to the mysterious deaths with increased security measures and suspicious scrutiny of their household staff, creating an atmosphere of paranoia and distrust that undermined the paternalistic relationships that had previously characterized interactions between masters and enslaved people. Ruth observed these developments with satisfaction, understanding that fear and uncertainty would make the remaining plantation owners less effective in their coordination efforts while potentially creating opportunities for additional operations that might benefit other enslaved communities throughout the region. The kitchen garden behind Whitmore Hall had become a pilgrimage site for enslaved people from neighboring plantations, visitors arriving under various pretexts while seeking knowledge about botanical properties and preparation techniques that might prove useful in their own circumstances. Ruth shared information carefully, teaching principles rather than specific applications while ensuring that her students understood both the possibilities and the risks associated with the kind of resistance that required absolute secrecy and perfect execution to avoid discovery and retaliation. The herb collection had expanded during the winter months as Ruth accumulated specimens that would support future operations, her reputation as an expert in culinary and medicinal plants providing perfect cover for activities that served purposes beyond household management or community health care. The greenhouse that Jeremiah had constructed for his wife's ornamental flowers had been converted into a laboratory where Ruth experimented with extraction techniques and concentration methods that improved the effectiveness of plant-based compounds while reducing the quantities required for desired effects. Knowledge preservation had become one of Ruth's primary concerns as she recognized that her accumulated expertise might be lost if circumstances forced her departure from Whitmore Hall, or if other events prevented her from continuing the educational work that had begun attracting attention from enslaved communities throughout Virginia. She had begun training selected individuals in basic botanical identification and preparation techniques, creating a network of informed practitioners who could adapt her methods to local conditions and opportunities while maintaining the security protocols that protected everyone involved from discovery and punishment. The documentation process required careful balance between preserving essential information and avoiding written evidence that might expose the artificial nature of deaths that authorities had attributed to natural causes or unfortunate coincidences. Ruth developed coding systems that disguised botanical formulas as ordinary recipes while creating reference materials that appeared to be nothing more than household management notes or gardening journals that would attract no suspicious attention from people who might examine her personal possessions. Communication networks had emerged among enslaved communities as news of the Thanksgiving event spread through informal channels that connected plantations across multiple counties, stories growing in the telling while inspiring hope among people who had never imagined that systematic resistance might be possible for individuals who possessed the right knowledge and appropriate opportunities. Ruth encouraged such developments while emphasizing the importance of patience and careful planning that would prevent premature actions from exposing capabilities that required secrecy to remain effective. The legend that was developing around the mysterious deaths had begun incorporating supernatural elements that provided additional protection for the human agents who had actually caused the events people struggled to explain through rational analysis. Stories about curses and divine intervention served Ruth's purposes by directing attention away from natural explanations that might eventually lead investigators toward uncomfortable truths about enslaved people's potential for sophisticated planning and coordinated resistance against seemingly overwhelming power structures. Spring's arrival in 1848 brought opportunities for expanded operations as traveling seasons resumed and social gatherings provided new context for the kind of hospitality that could serve multiple purposes simultaneously. Ruth had received invitations to assist with special events at other plantations, her reputation for culinary excellence creating access to households where her particular expertise might prove valuable in addressing problems that conventional solutions had failed to resolve adequately. The success of her Thanksgiving campaign had established precedents that could be adapted to different circumstances and objectives, demonstrating that systematic oppression contained vulnerabilities that could be exploited by those who possessed sufficient knowledge and determination to identify weaknesses that plantation owners had never considered might exist. The techniques she had developed could be modified for various applications while maintaining the appearance of natural occurrence that made investigation impossible and retaliation unlikely. Political developments at state and national levels had created additional opportunities for disruption as tensions between pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions intensified conflicts that might be influenced through strategic elimination of key supporters whose deaths would weaken organized resistance to changing social conditions. Ruth's capabilities positioned her to contribute to broader movements for social change while maintaining the local focus that had characterized her initial campaign against the families that had destroyed her personal happiness and security. The financial arrangements that emerged from estate settlements had inadvertently created opportunities for Ruth to acquire property and resources that would support expanded operations while providing cover for activities that required funding and logistical support beyond what household management duties could provide. Her position as trusted advisor to the Whitmore survivors had given her influence over decisions that directed money toward purposes that served her objectives while appearing to benefit the family's legitimate interests. Young abolitionists from northern cities had begun visiting Virginia under various pretexts, some seeking to establish underground railroad connections while others gathered intelligence about plantation conditions that might be useful for political campaigns against slavery expansion. Ruth's contacts with such visitors provided opportunities to share knowledge and coordinate activities that might benefit enslaved communities throughout the region while contributing to broader efforts to undermine the systematic oppression that characterized the plantation system. The transformation from grieving mother to strategic coordinator had revealed capabilities that Ruth had never suspected she possessed, skills that had developed through years of careful observation and patient analysis while maintaining the facade of devoted service that protected her from suspicion during the most dangerous phases of her campaign. The success of her operations had proven that invisible people possessed advantages that visible enemies could never overcome when circumstances aligned properly and preparation met opportunity. The herb garden continued producing the botanical resources that made resistance possible, Ruth's accumulated knowledge becoming a legacy that would outlive any individual practitioner while inspiring future generations to understand that justice delayed was not necessarily justice denied when the right person acquired the right capabilities at the right moment in history. The seeds she had planted would grow in ways that no one could predict or control, spreading knowledge and hope among people who had been taught to believe that their circumstances were permanent and unchangeable. Ruth Caldwell had demonstrated that systematic oppression contained the seeds of its own destruction when those seeds fell into the right hands at the right time, proving that the most dangerous enemy was always the one who served dinner with a smile while planning revolution with every carefully seasoned dish. The Thanksgiving feast of 1847 would be remembered as the moment when Virginia's plantation society learned that their greatest vulnerability lay in their inability to recognize the humanity and capabilities of people they had trained themselves to see as property rather than potential architects of their own destruction. The winter silence that had settled over Riverside County would eventually give way to spring conversations and summer revelations, but the changes that Ruth had initiated would continue growing long after the snow melted and the tobacco fields turned green again. Some transformations could not be reversed once they had taken root in fertile ground prepared by years of injustice and watered with tears that had finally found purpose beyond simple grief. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.